a lot of voters, especially with women and minorities. But that is apparently the strategy, and they've already been working on that even leading up to this.
Quick question for UJ political science professor Charles Bullock. Professor, from the debate, the infamous debate held here in Atlanta, through the Supreme Court decisions, through the assassination attempt, through today's announcement, as a professor of history, an incomparable, month plus in American politics, what are you going to be teaching your kids about this in 5 years?
Well, yeah, what I'll be teaching them this fall, which is, for some of them, this is going to be the first presidential election they've ever voted in. And so kind of tell them, yeah, this are extraordinary times in which we're living, in which you're getting prepared to cast your first ballot. And you may never see anything like this again if you live another 60 years or so even.
Geez, well, Peter, along that line, let me ask you, are you sitting there with your, jaw agog like many of the rest of us? Where does this event rank in your news pantheon?
Well, this is a political earthquake, and I really appreciate what the professor just said. I was just basically astounded. I saw this coming, but I didn't think it was going to be coming this soon. Earlier today, on all the network Sunday talk shows, top allies of Biden were saying, hey, we're going ahead. He's got campaign appearances planned for this week. You have to wonder what led him to make this sudden announcement today. Frank Biden, one of the president's brothers, told CBS's Nancy Cordes, the White House correspondent, she asked him if President Biden's health and vitality played a role in this decision, and he said yes. Surprisingly, he said yes, that it did. The White House certainly has, not taken that tact at all, and it is a very surprising comment from a member of the Biden family. Now, that doesn't mean that Frank Biden is speaking for the entire close-knit first family, Jill Biden and the Biden children, but he feels that his brother's health, and maybe he's referring to the fact that President Biden is suffering from COVID right now. I think, I think he must still be quite ill with that, or too ill to appear on television and speak to the nation on television and radio, because he's not doing that until later this week. We thought that he'd be departing his vacation home at Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, this evening to return to the White House, and now it's unclear if he's going to do that.
Professor, we've heard the term lame duck presidency before. Is that what we're entering now for Biden's last few months as president, a lame duck? And if so, since he's not, held back from the constraints of a re-election campaign, might we see a different Joe Biden?
Yeah, he certainly is going to be a lame duck. That means he has no great control over what other people do. But given the way Congress is, the narrow division between the two parties, there's not a whole lot that a president can do that requires upon Congress. Now, he may become more aggressive in using executive orders, which is the one thing he can do. He certainly has an incentive to try to push through more judicial nominations. But those are the few things which can actually be accomplished now, given the disarray within Congress.
Professor, I know you have somewhere to be, so when you need to take off, just tell us, and it's absolutely fine.
Okay.
We appreciate your time. It's 5:17 here at WSB. Georgia, which was undeniably purple, or at least lavender for a little while, has swung in Trump's direction in the most recent polls over the last couple of months. It is difficult to see how Kamala Harris might swing that back in the Democrats' direction, or frankly, any of the names we've heard bandied about. What do you think?
One of the things that she might do if she's the choice is that she might solidify the black support. And for a Democrat to win in this state, have to have not only strong black support, but also have to have enthusiastic African-American turnout. So she might be able to do those kind of things. And being a woman, obviously, and she's going to be, as Peter just said, probably attacked aggressively by Donald Trump, there is a risk with that, and that may remind women of the misogyny which they didn't like about Donald Trump 4 years ago. And so maybe it does bring Georgia back in play. Certainly she has become a known entity here in her many trips to Georgia.
I think, again, I'm not a political professor, just talk about it on the radio, but, go before the debate, the number one issue for Democrats was abortion and women's rights, and Kamala Harris has been on on the campaign trail, pushing that forward. Everything got changed with the debate and the Supreme Court and the assassination. But if the Democrats have a chance in not just Georgia, but a handful of other swing states, that they need to bring that back into the conversation. And she might be the best person to do that, to convey to voters that this is an important issue for the November election.
Well, certainly so, yeah, right. And, of course, another thing she or any of the other individuals who might get the nomination would have is that it may take care of those individuals we referred to as the double haters. Okay, they didn't like the options being offered to them. Okay, they're going to get a different choice, and that different choice is going to include a person from a different generation. So, that may also then work to the advantage of Democrats.
Peter, I got a question for you, going back to the Carter administration, because it's apples and oranges, but assuming it is Vice President Harris that leads the Democratic ticket in November, she has to pick a running mate. What was the process back when Carter got the nomination to pick his running mate?
Well, there was a whole guessing game going on back then, I should say, as to who he would choose. And, of course, he finally did choose Walter Mondale, a longtime Washington hand, and he chose him because of his experience. And he gave Mondale an office in the White House, the first vice president to have that. They usually parked the VP back then across the street in the old executive office building, now called the Eisenhower Executive Office Building. But Mondale had a lot of influence and a lot of power as the VP. I saw them together. They were together for a last time just a few years ago in suburban Washington, and they were very much in good spirits and in fine form back then.
Having said that, Professor, and I've noted, when Trump made his selection of Pence, it was a political move, right? Let's get someone that can woo the evangelical vote. When Biden was selected by Obama, it was like we need someone older with foreign policy experience. What questions need to be answered if indeed, and again, anything can change, but if it is Harris as the nominee, what holes should her running mate fill in that campaign?
Well, Democrats probably need, if they possibly can, to get someone out of the Midwest, and that would counter J.D. Vance, but it also then would help them in that blue wall that they need to mobilize. I'm going to have to get a step off here, but it's certainly been good being with you.
Professor, we really do appreciate your time on short notice. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
521 at WSB. Chris Chandler, Mark Arum, live breaking news coverage for the second weekend in a row. Joined by Peter Mayer, longtime CBS News White House correspondent, who before that worked right here at WSB for some time. You mentioned Walter Mondale. When Walter Mondale, President Carter's vice president, in turn ran for president himself in 1984, he was, feathered or saddled with whatever verb you'd like to use, the Carter administration record, which in the public perception was not all that even then. That's pretty much the same thing you think that's going to happen here. Yeah,
that was the Mondale Reagan race was something else. I don't know that it's going to happen this time. Times have changed. These are different personalities, and Kamala Harris has a different resume. Mondale had been a senator and then became vice president. She was attorney general in California, served some time as a senator, and then, of course, became vice president. I think, going back to the question, the really good question that you asked the professor about if Harris is the ultimate nominee with her name on the ballot and the buttons, who will she pick as her running mate? And I think he's on to something there. They do need someone probably from one of the Midwestern swing states. And then you start talking about Andy Beshear, the governor of Kentucky, not necessarily hard Midwest, but he's a guy who, is in a red state, and he's the Democratic governor, and he's had a lot of success. So he obviously knows that strategy, how to thread the needle there. You need somebody who's going to appeal to the white working men that Trump and Vance are going to be going after. So, there's a possibility of the governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro. There's just a big guessing game going on. It's fun to play the crystal ball game, I'm a little hesitant to do it, but I'm doing it anyway with you guys.
Does it have to? Does her running mate have to be a man? Is that a requirement? You think is America ready for a ticket with two females?
You know, that is a very sensitive issue because they're also talking about possibly they being, some of the people who are the Washington speculators and navel gazers. I heard them, a couple of people on the air today already saying, well, what about Michigan Governor Whitmer? She's a very tough campaigner. What about the two of them doubling down with two women candidates? That would be something else.
I'm going to play some audio. We're starting to get some reaction. Jim Hines, ranking Democrat in the House Intelligence Committee for my home state of Connecticut. I've had him on the show a bunch, reacting to the Biden announcement today.
The framing of this thing as a weakness in the Democratic Party gets it 100% wrong. We had a debate, and the most powerful man on the planet listened and undertook a selfless act.
We're seeing right now reaction pretty much along, from every Democrat that has spoken out, whether they're former presidents or current congressmen, applauding this move and saying this was the right thing to do. That's in the immediate aftermath, guys. Do you think we'll hear some dissenting voices maybe later today or tomorrow?
Peter, if it's like this...
you're asking me.
Yeah, well, if it's like this has worked out this last couple of weeks, it is... Everybody, politicians are known for not necessarily their courage, right? They wait for one or two people to come out and then the floodgates open. It may be a case here because even in the very top echelons of the Democratic Party, the former very top leaders, there's not consensus on whether or not to endorse Harris going forward. So it may take some time to sort out.
I think it's going to. It's not a done deal. And as I said, the Democratic Party has put out a statement to their small donors, their small money donors, saying, we promise you we're going to have a transparent process. Well, that process better play out pretty darn quickly because that convention in Chicago is going to be happening on August 19th. And that is just very, very quickly. It may seem like it was 2 years ago that there was that lousy debate performance and some of the Supreme Court decisions that have come down since then and the awful situation that played out last weekend in Pennsylvania with that attack on former President Trump. But the political clock moves very quickly, and a lot of, things are moving past all of those things that I just mentioned.
Peter, I'm glad you brought up donations because sadly I'm on the text list for both the Democratic and Republican Party, so I get their text messages all the time. And there was a marked change from Friday afternoon to today from the Democratic text. They were, instead of saying, hey, support Joe Biden, donate here, it was like, hey, what do you think about Kamala Harris? And, why don't you donate? They were, for the first time, putting Kamala Harris's name in these texts to try to get donations. I thought that was very telling, like, oh, all right, they're moving forward. They knew this was coming.
I had not seen that in any of the stuff that I've been monitoring, so that's very interesting.
Peter, what about the Biden legacy? Eric mentioned before you joined us that President Carter had not just years but decades to basically rehabilitate his image in the eyes of a lot of Americans and create a legacy of very good works, right? President Biden is obviously ill. He's obviously older. He's not going to have decades, I think, by any accounting you could possibly make. So as it stands, as he drops out of the race today, the Biden legacy, talk about it.
Well, I think, when you look at the things that he likes to boast, the cap on the charge for insulin, some of his foreign policy advances in bringing other countries into NATO and doing what he has been able to do in a very dicey situation to keep U.S. military forces out of the conflict, the war in Ukraine, while supplying weapons to the Ukrainians. So there will be, and you're so right that time is limited for him to work on his legacy, and but I don't think that's the top of his agenda right now.
Peter Mayer, WSBer from in the past and longtime CBS News White House correspondent. Man, you want to do some news on the weekend or come sit in on the morning news with me? You just give a call. Great to have you with us.
All right. Well, I'll have to audition, I suppose, but thanks a lot.
I think your reputation stands, man. Thank you very much for your time on
All
short
right,
notice.
and always remember, WSB means wear seatbelts.
That's
or at least that's what we said
This
back
last
then.
couple of weeks, man, he is not kidding, Mark.
There you go. Indeed. Yes. I thought we had a reprieve this weekend. I really thought going in, well, I knew that Biden was going to drop out. I felt in my heart, but I thought it was going to be after the prime minister's visit to D.C.
I
on
read that
Wednesday.
as well, and that seemed like a logical time. Eric, before we started here, said he may simply have had a hacking cough and couldn't sleep and woke up in the middle of the night and said,
Had a fever dream.
Yeah,
We've
maybe
all
that.
had those,
Maybe that.
indeed. What's coming up after the news, Chris?
We have our political science professor, Kerwin Swint, political scientist from Kennesaw State, who's covered campaign 2024 every step of the way with us. I wonder if he regrets not knowing what he was getting into at this point. But he is going to join us to analyze these latest developments, and we'll go to Washington in the next hour. Also talk to some of our top Georgia Republican and Democratic lawmakers as well. So hope you'll stay with us. Our coverage continues. Chris and Mark here with you till 8 o'clock.
It's 5:30 at WSB. I'm Jonathan O'Brien at the Breaking News Desk with continuing live in-depth team coverage of President Biden's decision to drop out of the 2024 race for president. Here's the latest.
CBS News special report. Just months before the election, President Biden drops out of the race. CBS's Nancy Cordes.
There are 107 days to go, and this is a very large ship to turn.
Mr. Biden announcing on social media he's ending his re-election bid. Delaware Senator Chris Coons co-chaired that campaign.
Excuse me. I'm sorry. This was a very difficult decision, and one that I think reflects the very best of who Joe Biden is.
There were increasing concerns about the 81-year-old's health and stamina. This voter weighs in.
I think it's best. I didn't see him beating Trump, and so it will be interesting to see how all things hash out.
Biden says Vice President Kamala Harris should be the Democratic presidential nominee. CBS's Ed O'Keefe.
There's no sign of anybody preparing to mount some kind of a challenge to her directly, understanding that she has the president's endorsement and now with so much goodwill towards the president and his decision, be hard to challenge that, perhaps.
CBS's Robert Costa spoke with former President Trump.
He is running, in his view, against the Biden administration, and he said he's running against their record. He called it the worst presidency in history. And he believes that he can run against President Biden's record and policies and win a large electoral victory this November.
CBS News Special Report, I'm Heather Bosch.
And political reaction rolling into us here at WSB. In a statement, Georgia Democratic Party Chair Nikema Williams saying, quote, "We thank President Joe Biden for his decades of public service. For the past 3.5 years, President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris have led our country's recovery from a global pandemic and made investments that have already created 30,000 new jobs in Georgia. President Biden said Georgia made him president, and he's right. There is more work to be done. Our eyes are on the prize. We must defeat the twice impeached, failed, 34-time convicted felon Donald Trump and his Extreme Project 2025 agenda." She goes on to say that we stand firmly behind Vice President Harris to make it happen. And again, that is Congresswoman and chair of the Georgia Democratic Party, Nikema Williams. Steve Henson, longtime Georgia Democratic leader and delegate to the upcoming DNC, says he respects President Biden's decision.
Certainly he knows all the factors involved, and I am sure he's made the right decision on what's best for himself, and I'm sure that one of his primary concerns is the best interest of this nation. So, yeah, I'm confident Joe Biden's judgment is correct.
In a statement, the Trump campaign saying tonight in part, quote, "Kamala Harris is just as much of a joke as Biden is. Harris will be even worse for the people of our nation than Joe Biden. Harris has been the enabler-in-chief for Crooked Joe this entire time. They own each other's records, and there's no distance between the two." We will have much more on this breaking news through the evening here on 95.5 WSB, but first, here at 5:33, we're going to step out to the 24-hour traffic center and check in with Jackson Heaton.
Moving pretty well in and around Metro Atlanta. Just looking at some minor congestion on the downtown connector 7585 southbound, starting around the Atlantic Station area through Georgia Tech, and you're back on them around the Grady Curve. And then expect a little bit of congestion if you're on the west side, I-20 eastbound. If you're coming into downtown, trying to get on 85 north, you might encounter a little bit of congestion there. And in Gwinnett County, 85 southbound around Jimmy Carter Boulevard, exit 99. A little bit of stop and go traffic there as well. I'm Jackson Heaton, 95.5 WSB.
I'm Channel 2 Action News Chief Meteorologist Brad Nitz with Atlanta's most accurate and dependable weather forecast. Keep some showers and storms around, possible really through this evening and overnight. And Monday, more wet weather, rain chance at 70%, low 71, high 85. And we'll keep that 70% chance of rain on Tuesday, low 72, high 86.
78 degrees in Mableton, 83 in Stone Mountain, and it's 84 degrees here in Midtown Atlanta. Stay with WSB for continuing coverage of President Biden's decision to drop out of the presidential race. Live coverage continues with Chris Chandler and Mark Aram next. I'm Jonathan O'Brien, 95.5 WSB.
President Joe Biden drops out of the race.
And endorsing Vice President Harris to replace him.
The details will change minute by minute.
The 81-year-old says he'll stay on the job through the remainder of his term.
Stay tuned for the very latest.
Speaker Mike Johnson is calling on the president to resign now.
When news breaks, it breaks here. 95.5 WSB, your 2024 election station.
This is Chris Chandler, and Mark, you said it a few minutes ago. It seemed just abundantly clear that this is what was going to happen. I have to say, this is not the way we expected or imagined it might happen.
Indeed. I didn't expect to be called into a Sunday. I felt in my heart of hearts that it would happen this week. The writing was on the wall. He got a brief reprieve, speaking of President Biden, after the coverage of the assassination attempt of his rival. But once that coverage started to die down, you heard the rumblings again in Democratic power corridors that he needed to step down because the poll numbers were getting worse and worse for him. Continuing our team coverage of this huge breaking political story is KSU political analyst Kerwin Swint. Professor, thanks as always for jumping on the breaking news.
Hey, good to be with you guys. What a boring campaign. Nothing interesting ever happens.
I know. Sorry to drag you out of bed there.
I said last week on my show, Professor, that Biden stepping down was a win-win situation for him, and I couched it as this. If he steps down and passes the torch to Kamala Harris and she wins in November, he is the Democratic Party hero. He saw what he needed to do. He ran that third leg of the 4x100 meters, gave the baton to Kamala Harris. She crossed the finish line. So if she wins, he's a hero. And if she doesn't win, or whoever the Democratic candidate is, he can sit back and say, I told you I was the only one. To me, it was a win-win situation for him to withdraw from the race.
Yeah, I mean, that's one perfectly reasonable way to look at it in terms of having something to lose. And I think the opposite of that is if he had stayed in the race as a candidate and then they do go on to lose, and he gets all the blame, right? He's the bad guy. So he really, really didn't want to do it. He tried everything he could to not drop out of the race, but in the end, the pressure was just too much. Congressional leadership on the Democratic side, and the money was drying up, which is a huge thing. Yeah. But I think ultimately what might have done it is the internal polling numbers they were looking at in the last several days, where Kamala Harris was running stronger than Joe Biden against Donald Trump in some of these swing states.
You know, it's hard to believe that we have 2 weekends in a row of where were you when you heard the news, right? But the question is, Kerwin, the unexpected way in which this broke. This is not how we thought this might go.
Yeah, this is historic. I mean, this has been such a crazy year, starting with that early debate and then the disastrous way it turned out for Joe Biden. It became inevitable after a period of time. I think the Democratic Party is looking at a real conundrum now, though, of, how do we pick up the pieces? And they're talking about that, I'm sure, tonight, and they're trying to figure out, okay, what comes next? The convention's in 4 weeks. Do we have some kind of preliminary process? And that's what several Democrats have called for. I think Barack Obama said we have to have a process. Congressman Clyburn a couple of weeks ago said, we should have some kind of process. So what does that look like? What's that going to involve? Is Kamala Harris anointed during some kind of process, or is there a true competitive system where you have, like, for example, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro may throw his hat in the ring, or some of the other Democrats that have been mentioned. That's going to be really fascinating over the next 3 to 4 weeks.
I would imagine that the power brokers have told the governor of Michigan, the governor of California, hey, you're going to have to pump the brakes on your political future, because if we're going to make this move, we have to be united behind someone else. As far as the mechanics are concerned, Professor, getting word that the Biden for President campaign has just filed a notice amending it to the Harris for President committee. There's actual paperwork that goes into making this switch.
Yeah, it becomes a process. It becomes a logistical situation where you have delegates that are coming to the convention in a few weeks. Now they're going to be Harris delegates. So you have to file certain paperwork to make that legal, to make that part of the Democratic National Convention rules. So those sorts of things will happen. And you're right about governors wanting to get in the race. I mean, pragmatically, no one's going to have a base of support to challenge Kamala Harris for the nomination. It's just that to a lot of people, a lot of Americans, this is going to look anti-democratic, right? Where they voted for Joe Biden in the primaries. That's who has been running for president all year. Now they're switching candidates, and so the whole thing is just unprecedented.
And that is certain to be a Republican line of attack. The unprecedented thing about this situation, though, is the notion that some people will see it as, all right, they're switching because he had fallen so far behind. But this idea that he is literally too old and ill to continue is part of the history here. It's really amazing if you just take a step back and look what has happened over this last few months. This has built and built and built.
Yeah, there are going to be several issues here, and Republicans are already calling for President Biden to not only not be a candidate for 2024, but to resign from office. If he's not capable of running a campaign, how is he capable of running a country? Now,
is there any chance of that, you think?
I don't see it happening because it's enough, from the Biden point of view. Okay, I'm stepping aside. I'm going to let Kamala Harris run for election. It's quite another thing to say I'm going to resign from the presidency. I mean, that's just a step I don't think he's willing to take.
I think campaign-wise, obviously the
Biden-Harris, they're going to flip that switch. I mean, you're now presumably going to have Donald Trump debating Kamala Harris in September instead of Joe Biden, if it comes off the way it's been planned. I think they'll flip that switch pretty quickly, though, the Trump campaign, because the issues are the same. And they're going to say it's Kamala Harris that is responsible for the border. She was the border czar, after all. They're going to say it's Kamala Harris that has been responsible for record inflation. It's Kamala Harris that has let foreign policy fall apart. These are going to be the things that the Trump campaign put at her doorstep. And so the personalities are going to change, the identities are different, but the policies, the issues, they're going to be the same.
And how good a candidate, then, is she?
She's going to have to be better than she has been. Everyone knows that has been paying attention to this, that she ran a truly dreadful presidential campaign in 2020 for the nomination. The public appearances that Kamala Harris has had mostly have not gone well. She has looked underprepared. She has looked to be not a serious public official or candidate. Now, those things can change. She's going to have an opportunity now to reset the public image that she has over the next days and weeks. She's going to have a fresh opportunity to reintroduce herself to the American people. And I can only imagine her team and the image makers in the Democratic Party are going to go all out to make something happen in a positive way.
KSU political analyst Professor Kerwin Swint joining us live on 95.5 WSB. Mark Arum, Chris Chandler continue to anchor our breaking news. President Biden, in a released letter today, announced he is not going to run for re-election. He's withdrawn his name from the campaign. And we're making assumptions here that Kamala Harris, he endorsed Kamala Harris. We're making assumptions, but it's not set in stone that she will be the Democratic nominee. But since we're playing the what-if game, Professor, if she is, does Biden have a role in the campaign? Does he go out campaigning for her, or is he stay in the Oval Office, stay in the West Wing, and kind of behind the scenes?
That's a great question, and you would think that they would want him involved in the campaign, right, to go and endorse her and talk about why the country is going to be in such great shape with her. But that's going to be a conversation that they have to have. I mean, they don't want him to necessarily overshadow her, for example. Or maybe he's just not going to be in a position to be effective in a campaign sense. So that's going to be interesting. I'm not sure which way they're going to go with that.
Half the people listening think Joe Biden was the worst president of all time. Half think he was one of the best of all time. So just knowing that before I ask this question, just on paper, I've been looking at Joe Biden's political resume. It's incomparable. Whether you hate that what he's done in D.C. for so long or you love it, that's a pretty impressive political resume that he's going to retire with.
Well, 50 years in elected office, committee chairmanships, vice president 2 terms, president in an environment of chaos in 2020 around the COVID disaster. Yeah, I mean, he's a historic figure. He's going to have a legacy that Democrats are going to be proud of. And no doubt, I think he's going to go out thinking he did a great job.
And has he salvaged that with this action today?
Well, I think he preserves his place as someone who served, right? As someone who did what he thought needed to be done, running in 2020, stepping aside in 2024 when it became inevitable that he just had to. So I think he's preserving his place. Now, how future historians and economists and sociologists look back on all this, we'll see. But I think he's at least preserving his place for a good place in history.
What about the critics, Professor, that are saying that the Democrats have usurped the democratic process, that Democratic voters didn't have a vote in a primary? There was a primary. I mean, it wasn't really contested heavily, but at the end of the day, it comes down to the 4,700 delegates at the Democratic National Convention that ultimately choose who will run.
Well, I mean, as we said, this is unprecedented, so the situation is very, very different. But, every incumbent president has a situation where his political party smooths the way for them. This happened for Trump in 2020. It happened for Obama in 2012 when they run for re-election in their party. Same thing happened for Joe Biden. They sort of smooth the way. So that's to be expected. So it's not a very democratic process. But, these are Biden delegates, and if Joe Biden says Kamala Harris is my candidate, I think a lot of Americans will accept that. Okay, well, it's Kamala Harris. She's on the ticket. It's her name on the bumper stickers. It's her campaign.
Let's talk about both the campaigns moving ahead now, because I don't want to say that they were each caught unprepared, because we don't know exactly what's been going on behind the scenes. But Harris has essentially no organization, no advertising, not a single campaign button that we know about. The Trump campaign has assumed, at least up until very recently, that Biden would be the opponent. We don't know how well they are prepared to wage an anti-Harris candidacy, but neither campaign has very much time to get things up and running. Time of the essence.
Well, they don't, especially on the Harris side. Now they're going to have the benefit of some of this money coming back, right? I mean, one of the reasons Biden was convinced to get out of the race is the donors are starting to say, we're not going to write checks anymore. They're going to start to write those checks again for Kamala Harris. So they'll be able to get a campaign up and running. They're going to be able to rely on some of the Democratic bigwigs, that are in Washington, D.C. to help them get started. There is some tension between the Harris team and the Biden team, though. So those kind of kinks are going to have to be worked out. On the Trump side, they're ready to go. They'll flip that switch. They'll make it all about Kamala Harris. But Donald Trump is going to have to be a little bit careful about how he attacks Kamala Harris, because it's a different campaign now. She's a different personality. It's a different identity. If they do have this debate in September, for example, he's going to have to be very thoughtful about how he attacks her, because Kamala Harris is going to rely on the female vote, on the African American vote. That's the one strength that she may be able to bring back is the black vote, the female vote in some of these suburban areas, places like Georgia, for example, North Carolina. And so all that to say, Donald Trump needs to think about how he's really going to go after her. I'm sure he will. That's in his DNA. He just has to be careful about it.
Professor, it didn't take long. We've been mentioning. I asked the question: how quickly can the Trump campaign pivot to Kamala Harris? We're already hearing a new Trump PAC ad that is going after Vice President Harris.
Kamala was in on it. She covered up Joe's obvious mental decline.
Our president is in good shape, in good health, tireless, vibrant.
I mean, that was quick.
There you go.
They had that in the can pretty early on, probably.
Yeah, that's modern campaigning, modern technology for you. They're ready to go like within the hour. And that little snippet you played, that's definitely going to be something that they attack Harris for, criticize her for, is that you had all of these Democrats and their friends in the media, they're going to say, who covered this up for years. They basically lied to everybody, including Kamala Harris. She knew there was a serious problem. She covered it up. So how can you believe anything she says? So you can already anticipate their line of attack on that.
One of those Democratic leaders that had been saying this is Biden's campaign, he's running, he's not getting out, was Jamie Harrison, the Democratic National Committee chair. We're now hearing from him post-Biden announcement?
I think about the transformational things we have seen over the course of these past 3.5 years, from the investment fighting against the climate crisis, helping those burdened by student loans, bringing down the cost of prescription drugs.
So now the decision has been made by the president. We're seeing his firmest supporters that were saying he should stay in the race. They've already acquiesced and they realize the new reality.
They have to flip. And so his supporters, the people close to him, were doing what they needed to do over the last week to 10 days. Now that the decision's made, they're going to rally around Kamala Harris because that's the next step. That's what you have to do in that situation.
How do you explain James Clyburn was on television as recently as this morning giving just a full-throated endorsement and support of President Biden? That has been his staunchest, most vocal constituency during all of this. Why and how, even if behind the scenes, will that block of lawmakers and voters react?
Well, James Clyburn is a politician who has a lot of love for Joe Biden. He feels very close to him. He, in fact, saved Joe Biden's candidacy, if you remember, back in the South Carolina primary back in 2020. That's where Joe Biden began to turn it around and ultimately win the nomination. But Clyburn, a week or so ago, was asked in an interview, what if ultimately Joe Biden does have to step down? And in this interview, Clyburn said, well, if that happens, I think Kamala Harris is the natural inheritor of the nomination, and I will support her. So there's been that in the back of their minds for a while, because I think they realize, this might in fact have to happen. And if it does, they're ready to have Harris candidacy instead of Biden.
It's 5:51 at WSB. Mark Arum, Chris Chandler here with you, covering breaking news. President Biden dropping out of the presidential race just a couple weeks before he was supposed to and had won enough delegates to be made the Democratic nominee for fall. He says he is endorsing his vice president, Kamala Harris, instead. We're checking the reaction now, getting some analysis from Kennesaw State University, a political science professor. Kerwin Swint here. How about in Georgia? A replacement candidate, would it make any difference? Things here have definitely swung Trump's direction in the past months.
Yeah, Trump's ahead in Georgia in the polls by from 5 to 6 to 7 points, depending on which survey you look at. Georgia, by and large, still can be looked at as a red state because governor, lieutenant governor, legislature, it's all Republican. So it's not surprising Trump would have a lead here. One thing that Kamala Harris might be able to do, though, is bring back some of those voters that voted for Joe Biden in Georgia in 2020. In certain states like Georgia, for example, the black vote's very significant. Kamala Harris could help them bring some of that back. She has been here recently several times raising money, talking about the Biden-Harris ticket. But there are other states, too, that could be in play more with Kamala Harris, like North Carolina. They put some of the resources and talk about North Carolina could be a Democrat-friendly state this year. But it's going to be tough. The economy is not in a place where Biden or Harris can claim a lot of credit for people feeling good about the state of the economy. Obviously, immigration, the Laken Riley issue is still felt here in Georgia, and that goes back to the immigration crisis. So, there are possible openings for Kamala Harris, but it's going to be a heavy lift.
I don't want to get too far out on the Shakespearean and metaphysical. You're not a playwright, you're a political scientist. But when we read the, the Final Days type book of the sorts that were written about Richard Nixon after he was forced from office and resigned, it's really a story, and I'm thinking specifically of Nixon's final days where his circle of advisors got to be smaller and smaller, and he got to be, in that case, more and more paranoid. President Biden, by all accounts, has been served by a smaller and smaller and smaller group of advisors over the past months, and very specifically over this last couple of weeks, who some reports say were basically telling him what he wanted to hear. And then he spent this last few days literally sick as a dog, alone up there in Delaware. What a, Shakespearean literary showbiz finish for this incredible story.
Yeah, I mean, it's especially the way you just put it there. I mean, it's sort of a tragic tale, tragic ending in a lot of ways. I guess we'll see when the books start coming out after the Biden presidency is over, like we did with Nixon. instead of the final days, this might be the final months, because this has been a months-long trajectory here. But you're right, the circle did get smaller and smaller and smaller as more Democratic members of Congress encouraged him to get out, as donors encouraged him to get out. So he was finally left with just his White House staff, his closest advisors, and obviously his campaign. And they were the ones valiantly saying, no, Biden is in it to win it, right until the very end.
I didn't think about the book angle of that. Yeah, who writes that book? Does Biden himself write that book? Does Jill write that book? Because reporting that Biden and his team started crafting the letter that was announced yesterday. So this wasn't something woke up this morning and said, all right, I'm going to do it. They knew yesterday that this announcement was going to drop today.
They're all going to write that book. There's going to be a book for everybody
We've seen
involved.
It, yeah, right.
I'm waiting for Hunter's book. His will be a bestseller.
That'll be the bestseller. Do you think he's been well served by those advisors?
Well, I think he has been, because their job, his inner circle, his campaign staff, their job is to look after him. Their job is to build him up. And they did what they were in the best position to do. I think they all had a feeling things were going south. They just felt powerless to do much about it, because Joe Biden is listening to very few people at the end of the day. It's Jill, it's his family, it's his very close advisors, people like Mike Donilon, for example. And so campaign staff has a very limited opportunity to really change things in that kind of direction.
And this is a huge drama, but that's everybody. That's who everybody listens to, truly.
Yeah. I mean, someone in that position, they have their kitchen cabinet, they have their family advisors. Think back to Trump, right? And he had his family around him, Ivanka, Jared in the White House, but also Don Jr. and Eric were frequent visitors to the White House. So you fall back on the people you trust, and a lot of times that's your family, but it's also people that you've been around for a long time.
Mark Arum, Chris Chandler, KSU political analyst, Professor Kerwin Swint here live on 95.5 WSB, continuing our breaking news of the huge announcement from President Biden today that he is withdrawing from the presidential race. And we're going to start going back and combing through interviews, just like the Trump campaign did, pulling that Kamala Harris audio for their latest ad. This is from CBS's Face the Nation last year, guys. And moderator Margaret Bremen asked Harris about her readiness for the job in light of the negative polls at the time regarding Mr. Biden's fitness for office.
Are you prepared to be commander-in-chief?
Yes, I am, if necessary. But Joe Biden is going to be fine. And let me tell you something. I work with Joe Biden every day. Under Joe Biden's leadership, we have transformed and are in the process of transforming America's infrastructure.
I don't have the audio at my fingertips, Professor. I'm sure Chris Chandler does. He's got an archive full of audio, but I vaguely remember in the presidential debates where Kamala Harris went after Joe Biden when they were both candidates pretty hard. I suspect we might see that audio resurface and seen in some political ads.
Yes, in one of the early debates in the 2020 cycle, Kamala Harris attacked Joe Biden during a debate over his historic support for policies as far as schools, minorities in schools, busing and the like. And she said, I was that black girl. I was that girl affected. And she directly attacked him on his policies. And that's something that lingered for a while. And that's something that some people were surprised he even selected Kamala Harris to be his running mate because of that direct attack. Now, she did drop out of the race as a candidate in 2020, not too long after that. And so salvaged a relationship. But I have read that the Biden family still harbors a little bit of resentment, a little bit of ill will for that direct line of attack on Joe Biden.
Looking at the political map, Professor, Biden has been falling in the swing states. Does Kamala Harris, again, if we assume that she is the nominee, does she bring in more of those suburban women? Does she bring in more African-American men and women? Does she bring in more Indian-American voters to the Democratic Party?
Right. So it is a campaign reset of sorts. The identities are certainly different. The coalitions might be shifting. We'll have to watch in the next few weeks what places like Georgia, Pennsylvania, the other swing states, Arizona, what the numbers look like. The hope for the Democrats is that Kamala Harris can re-energize, some of those constituencies you just talked about. Donald Trump in Georgia, for example, in 2016 and 2020. Now, he won Georgia in 2016, but he was weak in the Atlanta suburbs in 2016. 2020, the Atlanta suburbs is what sunk Donald Trump. And part of that is the suburban women, female voters who just weren't comfortable enough to vote for Donald Trump. Does he get them back, or is Kamala Harris able to sort of reset the race in a way that she gets their votes? That's the question, and that's what the Democrats are going to be strategizing about. So they're going to look at places like Philadelphia, for example, Pittsburgh, obviously in Michigan, the Detroit area, Michigan and Pennsylvania are crucial, and that's what they're going to focus on.
All right, Professor, thank you so much. Please don't block us on your cell phone. I know we have
Not a
been
chance.
calling you an awful lot, right? And we'll continue to rely on your expertise. Thank you for your time this afternoon.
You bet. Thanks.
Chris Chandler, Mark Arum, breaking news coverage continues. If you are just coming in, let's run down the latest from the top right now.
WSB Atlanta, WSB FM, and HD1 Doraville. 95.5 WSB, Atlanta's News and Talk.
It's 6 o'clock here at WSB. I'm Jonathan O'Brien at the breaking news desk with continuing live, in-depth team coverage of the news that President Biden is dropping out of the presidential race at this hour. Here is the latest as we know it.
CBS News special report. President Biden drops his re-election bid. Mr. Biden announcing that today on social media. CBS News elections correspondent Robert Costa.
This was a deeply personal decision for President Biden, something that he has been reckoning with for weeks since that debate in Atlanta, Georgia, where many Democrats believed he did not perform in a way that provided the party with confidence as it heads toward the November election.
That debate raised questions about the 81-year-old's health and stamina. President Biden has endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris as the Democratic presidential nominee. CBS News White House correspondent Nancy Cordes.
This is the president basically turning not only his endorsement over to the vice president, but also his campaign war chest, his campaign operation.
The Democrats hold their national convention next month. CBS News special report. I'm Heather Bosch.
Top Georgia Democrats, including all the way from Mayor Andre Dickens to U.S. Senator Jon Ossoff, are reacting to this news at this hour. Dickens calling Biden an extraordinary American. Ossoff saying that Vice President Harris is, quote, prepared, ready to win, and has my full support. University of Georgia political science professor Dr. Charles Bullock tells WSB this decision by the president is certainly historic.
Well, this has been expected, certainly in some quarters. Biden is maybe kind of going through the 5 stages of grief, and now has finally accepted what polls have been suggesting for, well, more than a year, and that is that he is not the strongest candidate Democrats could put forward, and that his prospects of winning were not good.
State Representative